There is a question that haunts literary history, and it has never been satisfactorily answered. In 1827, a man published what is almost universally considered the greatest novel ever written in the Italian language. A novel so complete in its world, so vast in its compassion, so precise in its historical vision, that Goethe praised it from Weimar and it was immediately translated across Europe. A novel that created, for the first time, something like a unified Italian national literature. And then the man who wrote it, who was 42 years old, in full possession of his powers, simply stopped. He lived for another 46 years. He watched Italy go through the Risorgimento, through the wars of independence, through the unification he had dreamed of all his life. He became a senator of the new kingdom of Italy. He outlived his first wife, his second wife, 8 of his 10 children. He lived long enough to see history vindicate almost everything he had believed. And he wrote nothing more. In the years of silence, from the end of the creative 15-year period in 1827 until his death in 1873, he moved away from the literary positions that had driven him to create I Promessi Sposi, the betrothed. 40 years of silence are a great many, and they are marked by that strange, improbable repudiation of the novel itself, in the form of an essay condemning the historical novel as a genre. This is the story of Alessandro Manzoni. And to understand the silence, we have to understand the novel. And to understand the novel, we have to understand the man who lived, for 15 blazing years, as one of the most extraordinary creative intelligences in European literature, and then, fell mute. Alessandro Manzoni was born on March 7, 1785, in Milan. He was the illegitimate child of a relationship involving Giulia Beccaria, daughter of the Enlightenment jurist Cesare Beccaria, and was officially recognized by Count Pietro Manzoni to avoid scandal. The genealogy matters. Cesare Beccaria was the author of On Crimes and Punishments, one of the founding texts of Enlightenment legal philosophy, the book that argued against torture and for rational, proportional justice, that influenced Jefferson, Voltaire, and practically every reformer in the Western world. Alessandro was the grandson, legitimate or otherwise, of that tradition. He grew up soaked in Enlightenment ideas, reason, progress, the perfectibility of human society through knowledge and law. Following the separation of his parents, Alessandro was sent to study in religious boarding schools from 1791 to 1801. It was an education he found suffocating. The mechanical piety of the institutions rubbed against the rationalist air he breathed from his mother's world. By the time he was a young man in Paris, frequenting the intellectual salons his mother moved in, he was a convinced freethinker. He read the philosophers. He absorbed the vocabulary of the French Revolution, liberty, equality, fraternity, and believed in it the way only someone born into a family whose defining text was about justice can. At these Paris salons, Manzoni came into contact with the Romantics, figures who concentrated their attention on the contrast between nature and society, who were aware of the influence of tradition and history, who rejected the absolute dominance of reason, and who lived critically through the failure of Enlightenment ideals. Important to him was the French historian and literary figure Claude Fauriel, who became a lasting intellectual reference. Through these contacts, Manzoni began feeling the insufficiency of pure Enlightenment rationalism, its inability to account for what history actually is, for what suffering actually means, for what justice actually requires when it confronts the full weight of human evil. He was ready, without knowing it yet, for a conversion. In 1808, Manzoni married the 16-year-old Genevan Enrichetta Blondel, a Calvinist, in Milan. The marriage was the catalyst for one of the most documented religious conversions in cultural history. According to anecdote, in 1810, during the celebrations for Napoleon's wedding to Maria Luisa of Austria, the crowd panicked and Manzoni was separated from his wife. In the grip of an agoraphobic attack, he took refuge in the church of San Rocco and emerged converted. The story is almost certainly embellished, if not entirely invented. In reality, the conversion was a gradual process that he undertook together with his mother and his wife, under the guidance of two Jansenist priests, Father Di Gola and Father Tosi. The Jansenist flavoring of this conversion is crucial. Jansenism was a deeply serious, deeply uncompromising strand of Catholic thought, born in France in the 17th century, most famously associated with Pascal. It held that human beings are radically incapable of achieving salvation through their own will, that divine grace is sovereign and irresistible, that the number of the truly saved is small, and that honest reckoning with human evil and moral weakness is the only starting point for genuine faith. Jansenist teachings were condemned by the Catholic Church, but their influence did not remain confined to France. The conversion, influenced by Jansenism, led Manzoni to integrate the revolutionary values of liberty, equality, and fraternity with evangelical principles. He came to see faith as a confirmation of those values, now grounded on something more absolute than reason alone. But, and this is the key tension, the creative period between 1810 and 1827 was the most fertile of Manzoni's life, producing the major works, the Inni Sacri, the tragedies, the civil odes, and his famous novel. In those 15 years, his Jansenist understanding of history as the record of human weakness and divine grace operating through it, his liberal inheritance from Beccaria and the Enlightenment, his romantic sense of the collective historical experience of peoples, all of these forces converged in a single creative explosion. And the product of that explosion was I Promessi Sposi. The novel is set in Lombardy in 1628 to 1630, under Spanish domination. Two young peasants, Renzo Tramolino, a silk weaver, and Lucia Mondella, are about to be married. Their local priest, Don Abbondio, is intercepted by hired thugs of the local feudal lord Don Rodrigo and is warned not to perform the ceremony. Don Rodrigo wants Lucia for himself. And from this simple, brutally human premise, Manzoni builds an entire world. Don Rodrigo has Lucia kidnapped by the Innominato, the unnamed, another nobleman steeped in crime, but the sight of the girl so unjustly tormented, and the arrival of Cardinal Borromeo, provoke in the sinister figure a crisis of conscience. Instead of delivering Lucia to Don Rodrigo, the Innominato releases her. Meanwhile Renzo has arrived in Milan while the people riot over famine, and, mistaken for one of the ringleaders, is forced to flee to Bergamo. Lombardy is ravaged by war and plague, but Renzo returns to Milan to find his betrothed. He finds Lucia in the Lazaretto, a quarantine hospital, alongside Fra Cristoforo, who tends the sick, among whom, abandoned by all, lies the dying Don Rodrigo. When the plague subsides, after so many trials, Renzo and Lucia can finally become husband and wife. The bare plot summary does almost nothing to convey what the novel actually is. What it actually is can be said only in fragments. It is one of the most complete worlds any poet has ever created. The setting in Milanese territory under Spanish domination had an important parallel with the Italy of the Risorgimento, with parts under Austrian occupation. The 17th century is a mirror for the 19th. Every injustice that afflicts Renzo and Lucia, the impunity of the powerful, the cowardice of institutions, the arbitrary violence of feudal privilege, the helplessness of the poor before systems designed to crush them, was alive and contemporary for Manzoni's readers. But the novel is not a political pamphlet. It is something far more capacious. Its true protagonist is not Renzo or Lucia, but the people, il popolo, the collective human experience of a historical epoch, rendered in its full complexity, the heroism and the pettiness, the faith and the superstition, the courage and the cowardice that coexist in every community, in every century. The Plague chapters, covering the 1630 epidemic that devastated Milan, are among the greatest sustained pieces of historical narrative prose in Western literature. The contagion was brought to Lombardy by the German troops under Albrecht von Wallenstein, who came down through the Valtellina on their way to besiege Mantua, and in whose ranks plague had been endemic for some time. The passage of the Lanzichenecchi left a trail of terrible sacking and devastation. From this documented historical calamity, Manzoni builds something extraordinary, a vision of collective catastrophe in which every character, from the dying Don Rodrigo to the selfless Fra Cristoforo, from Renzo searching for Lucia through the lazaretto to the cardinal performing his ministry among the sick, reveals himself completely under the pressure of absolute extremity. And it is here that the central theological question of the novel becomes impossible to ignore. Manzoni believed in providence, in the idea that divine care operates through history, even through plague, even through injustice, even through the suffering of the innocent. The novel ends happily, Renzo and Lucia marry, the tyrant does not win, the coward Don Abbondio survives, the world continues. And this happy ending, guaranteed by the author's faith, is both the novel's greatest strength and the source of its most serious critical challenge. Benedetto Croce, the most important Italian literary critic of the 20th century, initially charged the novel with what he called oratoria, the rhetorical will to convince the reader that faith guarantees the happy outcome, that providence will arrange things well, that the celestial harmony is real. Another critic, and a malicious one, called it a fairy tale narrated by an erudite historian. But that cannot be true. Indeed, even Croce eventually withdrew his own criticism. Because the novel does not hide the horror. It does not soften the terror of what happens to Renzo and Lucia, to the people of Milan, to the victims of plague and feudal violence. Providence in the novel is not an external force that saves from without, it is rather a voice that resonates in the interiority of conscience, it is the capacity to truly listen to the voice of God and follow it. If injustice exists, and Manzoni never tires of denouncing it, this depends on human responsibility, not on God. Individuals are free to choose between good and evil. The difference matters enormously. This is not a novel that says, "Don't worry, God will fix everything." It is a novel that says, the world is full of tyranny, cowardice, plague, and injustice, and through all of that, human beings are capable of choosing to act with dignity, compassion, and love. The harmony is not easy. It is earned, at immense cost, by people who had multiple reasons to abandon hope and did not. It is a tragic idyll, an idillio tragico. And if the sky above Manzoni's Lombardy resembles the dome of a church, it is because inside that dome there is the full weight of human suffering, looking upward. Among all the characters Manzoni created, and it is one of the most fully peopled novels in world literature, two stand out as creative achievements of a different order. Don Abbondio is the cowardly priest who refuses to perform the marriage because he is afraid, and who spends the novel being afraid of everything, of Don Rodrigo, of the plague, of responsibility, of conscience. He is not evil. He is something more disturbing than evil, he is ordinary. He is the man who sees the right thing to do and consistently chooses not to do it, because it is dangerous, because it might cost him something, because the powerful are powerful and the weak are weak, and it has always been so. It is a serpentine creation. Don Abbondio is a cousin of Sancho Panza, the universal figure of the man of prudent cowardice, rendered with such indulgent irony that you cannot quite hate him, even as you recognize, in him, some of your own flaws. The Innominato, the unnamed, is Don Abbondio's opposite, a man who has committed every crime available to a powerful nobleman in 17th-century Lombardy, and who, in his encounter with Lucia's simple, terrified dignity and with Cardinal Borromeo's serene authority, undergoes a conversion. The cardinal gathers the Innominato's confession, favoring his conversion. Manzoni was inspired by the real figure of Federigo Borromeo, Milanese patriarch, cousin of San Carlo, venerated as a saint, who was fundamental during the plague of 1630 in remaining close to the sick. The Innominato's conversion is one of the great scenes of European romantic fiction, not because it is sentimental or implausible, but because Manzoni renders it with absolute psychological credibility, a night of torment, a consciousness that has finally run out of defenses against itself, a dawn in which everything looks different not because the world has changed but because the man has. Lucia, who may appear colorless, in fact plays a central role in the novel's economy. She is the one who triggers in the Innominato the spring that leads him to conversion, making light, luce, the same root as her name, in his tormented soul. She is the figure who acts not through force or intelligence or cunning but through sheer, defenseless humanity, and who proves, in the end, to be the most powerful agent in the story. Before the novel, and alongside it, Manzoni was composing the works that made him the greatest religious poet of the Italian Risorgimento, the Inni Sacri, the sacred hymns. The project for the sacred hymns was conceived in 1812, and was intended to comprise 12 poems, each dedicated to a major Christian feast. In the end, Manzoni completed only 5. But those 5, La Risurrezione, Il Nome di Maria, Il Natale, La Passione, and above all La Pentecost, constitute the most grandiose Catholic poetry that the modern era has produced, precisely because they are free from any conventional edifying sentiment and from any sentimentalism. The hymns are not devotional in the comfortable sense. They do not reassure. They do not perform piety. They are expressions of the collective soul confronting the presence of the divine in the destiny of the world. The Pentecost, with its vision of the Holy Spirit descending into history as the force that levels all human distinctions, come upon the orphan of good works upon the humble, is a hymn that a Jansenist could write and a liberal could believe and a revolutionary could read without betrayal. It is all of those things simultaneously. The civil odes, Il Cinque Maggio, the great elegy for Napoleon, and Marzo Miliato Centaventuno, written in anticipation of the Italian uprising, show another face of the same mind, the poet who can hold grief and political passion and historical judgment in the same lyric breath. And then, after 1827, nothing. Or almost nothing. Between 1828 and 1831, Manzoni wrote the Essay del Romanzo Storico, on the historical novel, published in 1850, in which he argued that the absolute truth of historical objectivity could only belong to historiography, and that the historical novel, as a hybrid of the true and the invented, was a falsification of truth. This is the essay in which Manzoni condemned the genre he had just enriched, in which he condemned the achievement of his own masterpiece. It is one of the strangest critical acts in literary history, a writer using his best intellectual faculties to prove that his greatest work was philosophically illegitimate. The true source of this paralysis was ruthless precision. Manzoni's conflict was within his own faith. His Jansenist inheritance gave him a sense of history as the record of human weakness and divine grace, and it gave him, crucially, the liberal historian Augustin Thierry's reading of history as class struggle, as the conflict between the powerful and the humble. I Promessi Sposi is, in Angelandria Zottoli's felicitous phrase, the novel of the powerful and the humble, il romanzo dei potenti e degli umili. The Jansenist predestinarian streak is visible everywhere in it, in the providential structure, yes, but also in the terrifying figure of the Monica di Monza, the nun of Monza, a woman destroyed by the aristocratic system of forced vocations, whose tragedy Manzoni renders with a compassion that barely conceals fury. But the conflicts multiplied. Manzoni's Italian nationalism collided with his Catholic universalism. His liberalism collided with his Catholicism. His romantic historical sense, his feeling for the organic development of peoples, close to Johann Gottfried Herder and Edmund Burke, collided with the progressive, universalist implications of his Jansenist faith. There was no resolution available. Every path led to contradiction. The moral rigorism and religious scrupulousness, the aversion to any form of polemic for fear of offending, the ascetic pursuit of truth, these brought Manzoni to participate in the great debates of his time only through very carefully considered writings, with no passionate engagement in cultural or political life. The cautions and fears often reached the point of inhibiting action. And so he stopped. The man who had written about Providence, who had built a novel around the faith that history moves toward justice, that patience and love and dignity are vindicated in the end, found himself unable to write anything more. 40 years of silence are a great many. The thesis that if Manzoni's religiosity had been truly alive it would have inevitably expressed itself is not unfounded. The true tragedy of Manzoni is this evasion that ended in muteness. Instead of making history, he was condemned to suffer it, but he suffered it with the hope that echoes from the pages of his own novel, DT loro coperdinino semper, semper, tutto, tutto. Tell them to forgive always, always. Everything. Everything. Alessandro Manzoni died in Milan on May 22, 1873, 5 days after a fall on the steps of the Church of San Fedele. He was 88 years old. He had outlived almost everyone he loved. Giuseppe Verdi composed the Requiem, one of the supreme works of 19th-century music, in his memory. What he left is a novel that some do not hesitate to name the greatest historical novel ever written. A claim that, 2 centuries after its first publication, remains essentially uncontested. Not the most exciting historical novel. Not the most dramatic or the most technically inventive. But the most complete, the one in which a full world, with all its suffering and all its grace, is held in the hands of a narrator who stands at the same distance from every character, with a divine-like patience and impartiality. This human comedy of Italian literature left, like the other great comedy, Dante's, an expression of love that moves the sun and the other stars. It is simply a request. Forgive. Always. Everything. For a man who spent 46 years in silence, it is worth asking whether that sentence wasn't, in the end, enough. Thanks for watching. See you next time with another human story.